Hey everyone, I want to take you along with me for a busy weekend day of homemaking, cooking, and projects on the homestead. So just like most other weekends, we have a busy weekend planned here at our homestead, and we like to start off weekend mornings with a bigger breakfast just so they feel a little more special. So I'm just starting off with some breakfast here, cooking up some bacon and some hash browns and eggs, and we're going to start off with that to set ourselves up right for this busy day before we move on to some other projects. These hash browns are one of our favorite ways to eat potatoes, and they're so easy to make. All I do is shred some potatoes, I leave the skin on, and then I just get a cast iron skillet really hot with some butter in it, add those right into the skillet with some salt and pepper, just stir all of that around so everything is evenly distributed, and then pop those in a 400-degree oven until they are really crispy. And they are so yummy when paired with some bacon and eggs in the morning. So now that breakfast is finished up, I needed to get started with some sourdough projects right away because I needed to get my starter fed so that it would be active a little later this afternoon. But before I fed it, I wanted to go ahead and get a discard recipe in. So I'm just making my standard sourdough tortillas here. That recipe is over on the blog. And after I get those mixed up, I want to get my starter fed. If I feed my starter pretty early in the morning and I get it in a warm location, it will be ready for me to mix up bread by the afternoon, and I can get all of my stretch and folds in and sometimes even get it shaped before bedtime. Not always, sometimes I just let it continue to ferment throughout the night and then shape it the next morning. It just depends on how much warmth I have going on in my kitchen. A lot of times sourdough just is not this cut and dry process. You have to read your dough and learn to see what your dough is doing. Sometimes it's going to take 6 hours to rise, sometimes it's going to take 16 hours to rise. But if it's doubled, then you know that you are pretty good to go to get it shaped and into the refrigerator for a bulk ferment in the fridge. A lot of times on these winter days when my kitchen is a little bit cooler, I like to jumpstart that process where my starter will become active by just putting it in the oven with the light on. But of course, make sure if you try that trick, do not turn your oven on. All right, moving on to a couple other projects. I am just starting some broccoli sprouts here, and that recipe is also over on the blog, or I guess more so tutorial, because this is just growing some broccoli sprouts in a mason jar right on the counter. I like to keep these in rotation because they're really healthy and they're a great way to get in some freshness if there's not quite as many fresh greens available. So now I'm just going to be finishing up a roast, very simple, just putting a chuck roast in a pan with some salt, pepper, onion, and celery. And I'm going to be cooking this in the oven basically all day at 300 or 350 degrees until it is very, very tender. And later on, I'll be adding some potatoes and carrots for an easy, delicious dinner. So here I'm just making a batch of sauerkraut, which is something else that I like to keep on rotation. Again, it is so healthy. Basically just a spoonful of this on your plate once a day is going to give you the probiotics that you need for each day. And so to make this, all you do is rough chop your cabbage and then weigh it on your kitchen scale. And then whatever that weight is, you need to multiply that by 0.02 to get 2% of that weight. And that's how much you need to weigh out in sea salt. And then you're just going to sprinkle that salt into the cabbage and massage it in until you are starting to see a lot of liquid pool at the bottom. Then you're just gonna grab a really clean mason jar and pack it into the jar really, really tightly. That is one of the keys to this recipe, is to get it packed in there really tightly. And just keep packing until you have all of the cabbage in there. And by the time you are at the top of your jar, you should have enough liquid at the top to cover the cabbage. That is the other key. You do have to have the top of the cabbage covered with liquid or it will mold. So just keep packing that in really tightly until you have liquid at the top, and then you'll want to weigh it down with something. You can use an actual fermenting weight. I honestly just use some marbles in a smaller jar on the top, and then just leave it at room temperature with a covering on it that's loose for a few weeks, and then you have some delicious fermented sauerkraut. And that recipe is over on the blog if you want to see the full written instructions. A lot of times I like to just see what I have on hand that needs used up. Case in point, I just made the sauerkraut, but I had some cabbage left over, so I knew I needed another side dish with the pot roast for this evening. So I decided to just go ahead and use up the rest of that cabbage with some grated carrot and pepper and make some really simple coleslaw. So I find that the more often that I'm able to just look around and see what I have that needs used up and then base my meal planning on that, the less likely I am to have a lot of waste at the end of a week. So I decided to just do that simple coleslaw, and I'm making a really simple dressing for this. I am making my homemade mayo because I was out of it, but thankfully it only takes a couple minutes to whip together. So I'm just making that homemade mayo, adding some white vinegar and some salt and pepper and lemon juice, and that made a perfect salad dressing for this coleslaw. And if you do want to know that full recipe for the mayonnaise, that's over on the blog as well. A lot of these things are just staples that I keep in our home, so that whenever I want to pull something together like this, it's really easy to do that quickly. Of course, in this case, I did have to make the mayonnaise, but quite often I do just have a jar of that in the fridge, and it's just waiting for me ready to go. If you're wanting to get into making more things from scratch like this and getting away from purchasing bottles of dressing and things like that from the store, I know that that can seem daunting up front, but if you kind of just get into a routine of keeping basic staple things on hand, it is not quite as daunting in the long run, so that you can pull something together quickly. You can pull something together with those tortillas that we made, or the bread that we're going to be making later, or the mayonnaise that I just showed you. The more that you can just keep things like this on hand and make a schedule for yourself of when you are going to meal prep whatever it is that you're wanting to start keeping on hand from scratch, the more easily you can pull together different foods like this without feeling overwhelmed. While I was working on some of these indoor things, Brad had a pretty cool project going on outside that I'm going to give you a sneak peek of here in a minute. But first I had to take a walk out to our garden and see our garlic that's popping up. We planted this last fall and it'll be ready sometime this spring. And we have our winter rye cover crop coming up that we're going to be tilling in come springtime before we plant our first crop, and everything's looking great. So Brad was working on getting some trees out of what we call our little tree island. These are just some scraggly little trees that were on our property, and they really don't serve any purpose. They're not even that pretty. So we decided we want to take them out and see what kind of soil we have to work with. And we're hoping to put our orchard in this area, hopefully getting a few trees in this spring, but we're just gonna have to see how that goes. A lot of times things take a long time on homesteads, so we're just kind of taking it one step at a time and getting these trees out of here first of all. So at this point in the day, my roast was getting tender, so I needed to get it finished up by adding some red and golden potatoes and some carrots, And this is such an easy meal. If you are looking for the easiest from scratch meal ever, honestly, I would say it is pot roast. All you do is bake the meat all day long on a low heat and get it really tender, add in some potatoes and carrots, and you're done. It does take a lot of baking time, but it takes very little hands-on time. So definitely add this to your arsenal if you're looking for easy meals that take less than 30 minutes of hands-on time. And once you add in those potatoes and carrots, just add a little more salt and pepper and bake it for about another hour until those are tender, and you have a really easy meal ready to serve. While that is continuing to bake, I went ahead and got my weekly loaf of bread mixed up. My sourdough starter became active a little later in the day than I was hoping, so I'm definitely not going to have time to get this shaped and into the fridge before bedtime. But the great thing with sourdough recipes is they are honestly very adaptable. A lot of times people think that sourdough is very scary, but once you get the hang of it, you see that there's actually a ton of flexibility with this. So I'm just gonna mix this up and get my stretch and folds in before bedtime, and then I'm gonna leave it on the counter all night long, and then it will be risen and ready to shape by the next morning. Now, there are some rules with it. Of course, you don't want to over ferment your dough because then it just doesn't shape very well and it doesn't rise very well in the oven either. But if your kitchen isn't that warm like mine is in wintertime, you're going to be totally fine to leave this all night long, and hopefully by the morning it will be doubled and ready to go. I actually find that as a general rule with sourdough recipes, give yourself more time than less. More often than not, I find that I didn't give myself enough time and it just hasn't risen like it needs to, rather than letting it go too long and having it over ferment. And finally, the last cooking project of the day on this busy weekend day on the homestead was one of our favorite simple desserts, this apple crisp, which is just some sliced apples and a crumble topping made of oats and flour, cinnamon, butter, and a little bit of sweetener, baked until everything is nice and tender, and served with some ice cream if you prefer. And that recipe is over on the blog as well, so of course I'll have that linked. As usual, I thank you guys so much for joining us this week, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.